True crime junkies of Reddit, what is a case or story you've heard that actually kept you up at night? Catherine Knight. In the Hunter Valley NSW, this crazy bitch worked at an abattoir, and loved her work. Kept her butcher knives above her bed. Pure psycho, had a string of boyfriends and husbands, did things that made them nope the fuck out of there. The last boyfriend she had, John Price, she stabbed him to death, skinned him, hung his skin from a meat hook in a doorway in the house, cut parts of meat from his dead body, cooked it up with vegetables and served it up on plates for his kids. Police also found his severed head in a pot on the stove. This crazy bitch is the only woman in Australia to ever be sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Husband and wife had a daughter killed ripped apart by dogs. But at trial the wounds were clean like they were made with a knife, so the jury convicted and they went to jail. It was found out years later that the hospital, in trying to save them, cut away the infected parts with a scalpel. So fucking scary that these people lost their young child, then were convicted and sent to prison for something they obviously didn't do. They couldn't even mourn their kids properly. I think it was like 150,000 innocent people a year get sent to prison for something they never did. Think it's said that in the beginning of some movie. That's a lot. It almost happened to me. My ex said rape, sexual assault and abuse. But I had evidence, so they threw out the case. Worst part is she didn't get arrested or even a fine. Abducted in plain sight is one of the wildest and most nonsensical child abduction/grooming stories you will watch in your life. Basically, this little girl's neighbor snatches her up, convince her that she's an alien and has to hook up with him. Also, he convince her father to give him a hand job, and I think he hooks up with her mom too. I have yet to find a documentary as compelling as this one. I can't remember the name, nor will I do a good job of explaining it, but it was of these two teenage brothers who decided they wanted to become serial killers. Before they started, they thought they needed to kill their entire family first so they could have a base of operations. They killed their parents, and their younger brother didn't know what was happening and locked themselves in their bathroom with a baby. The part that really breaks my heart is, one of the brothers pounded on the door and tricked the boy into letting him in, because he said the other brother was the killer and he needed to hide from him. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 9, let him in and he was killed along with the baby. All this was recorded during a 911 call. My memory of the case is hazy, but I believe the sister, though she was stabbed, managed to get outside the house and alert neighbors. Anyways, fuck them. I believe the family has a small gazebo in their memory, but I may be wrong. That definitely sounds like the Bever brothers. The baby wasn't killed though. The police showed up before they could kill her, and I think they were planning on smashing her head in with a rock. Also, you are correct, the other sister survived. The brothers were wannabe serial killers, but news also came out that the parents may have been abusive, so that could have also been a motive. The children were homeschooled and weren't allowed to socialize with anyone. Crystal, the 13-year-old that survived, testified that her parents physically and verbally abusive to all of them. The brothers would also confirm this. It's just a sad story all around. I decided to listen to the tape of the Jonestown massacre once, and it definitely scarred me. It's so upsetting. It's beyond heartbreaking to think of all those folks murdered, manipulated by a single awful megalomaniac asshole. Most of the deaths were children. You can hear them starting to cry as people start dying. One of the worst moments is there's this point where a woman tries to argue letting the children go, and you hear this backlash from the crowd of brainwashed adults how it would have been wrong to let the children live. Jones egging them on, of course. I hate that man. Specivjev case. Extremely fucked up. The guy was schizophrenic and was luring children into his apartment, torturing and apparently eating them. One level of fucked ups, neighbors called cops at all the screams a lot, but he just didn't open his door to police, and they were like, "May, the guy is mental and probably screams himself, we can't do anything about it." One level of fuck-uppery, it was his elderly mother who was luring his victims into the apartment and helped to dispose of the bodies by feeding them to stray dogs. They even cooked one girl and made her friend eat the meat. Cherry on top, the mom has served her time in the mental hospital and now lives free somewhere in Siberia. This one happened a couple streets away from me and was the whole reason I developed an interest, but it still disturbs me. The case of Becky Watts. She was a teenager who went missing, and it turns out her stepbrother, I think, and his girlfriend suffocated her, sawed her body into pieces and put her in a suitcase and left her in a garden shed. What makes this so terrifying for me personally is I was a little younger when it happened, and I vividly remember walking home from school and being terrified cause I saw a black bag full to the brim and tied up on the road, and knowing she was missing, I out 2 and 2 together, it fucking terrified me. Kenneth Allen McDuff. Get this, he murdered 3 teenagers in cold blood in the mid-60s. He was caught, convicted and sentenced to death by electrocution for it. His sentence was relegated to life in prison after the US suspended the death penalty in the 70s. Then, he gets released from prison due to overcrowding in 1989, and went on to murder more people in cold blood. One victim, Colleen Reed, was kidnapped by Macduff while she was at a car wash. She then had cigarettes put out on her and then was raped and murdered. Macduff joked in prison that she squawked like a chicken when she was strangled. He was a complete piece of shit, but what blows my mind is that Texas of all states let this obvious psychopath slip through the cracks. Colleen Reed, Melissa Northrup, and Regina Moore would still be alive today if Macduff never got out of prison. Texas has blood on their hands here. I have 3. Junko Furuta most definitely. She went through 45 days of torture, assault, dehumanization. All for her killers to walk free. The murder of Ronald Woodsworth by Shelley Notick. I cried until I was sick when I read the account in If You Tell by Greg Olson. The murder of Buddy Musso made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't even get through the 30-minute watered-down ID special on it. I watched a documentary where they interviewed her a few years ago. She was in her 20s I think, and she saw her estranged dad after a very long time, and it was bittersweet. She grew up to be such a kind and emotionally intelligent person, and seems to have a lot of regrets about what went down with her mother. It's just amazing to me that someone who was so sheltered as a child turned out to be so well-adjusted and /normal/. Her dad seems to be very sweet as well and blames himself for not seeing through her mother's actions. But I hope she's released soon and lives a normal happy life. It happened close to my hometown, near Hamelin in Germany. I came into contact with the case in a professional context a few years after Stefan had disappeared. 2003-04 he had come into contact with a couple who had 6 older daughters and had practiced habitual sadistic violence masked as a satanic cult. They did really terrible things to their victims like physically bolting them to the kitchen floor and burning them with a flat iron. I found out that the authorities had caught and locked up both parents after one daughter went to the police. But they weren't able to try them for the disappearance of Stefan Heenelt, because no trace of him was ever found. While the parents served their time in prison for aggravated assault, the police found some sort of ritual site in the woods near their house where I pass from time to time, but no body. Everything points into the direction that Stefan was killed. So there was a time when the police tried to find the evidence to charge the couple with murder, but the investigation went nowhere. It makes me sad, and I think a person that just disappeared that way shouldn't be forgotten, and the fear, pain and suffering he must have felt shouldn't be pointless. And I also have the impression that a killer probably has walked free. Hello Kitty murder, name is already giving mixed messages lol. A group of men committed the murder/torture of a young woman somewhere in China and forced some little girl to watch, who later reported it to the police. They killed the woman after about a week of torture, and stuffed the body in a mermaid Hello Kitty stuffed plushie. I'm a big fan of Hello Kitty, have been ever since I was little, and I had a lot of Hello Kitty plushies scattered all over my room, but ever since that case, I can't look at them the same way again. The story of Colonel Russell Williams. Big guy in the Canadian military that's now in prison for murdering 2 women and raping others. He had a long history of breaking into people's homes and stealing women's and girls' underwear. The part that gave me the heebie-jeebies was one occasion that he recounted where he had snuck into a woman's house and she happened to come home. He hid and said at one point she literally walked right by him and didn't notice he was there. I was checking inside closets and behind the shower curtain for a bit after listening to that. Toybox Killer. It's one of the few I didn't read the story of. I have an understanding of what happened and the amount I know is too fucking much. The FBI agent in charge of the case killed himself, it broke him so bad. It's absolutely horrible. Also that Japanese girl, I think her name was Junko. There's a few more but I actively try to forget them and block them. For me there's true crime I find interesting in a morbid way like Dahmer or Ed Gein and stuff like that, but the ones with excessive torture is too disturbing. I know Dahmer could be considered torture but it doesn't mess with me like the others at all. BC he usually drugged his victims and got them drunk, not kept them alive long periods while making their lives pure agony and degradation. I really wish we had some medieval executions that we saved specifically for the people like the Toy Box Killer. If they were found guilty without a shadow of a doubt, they should be slowly broken on the wheel then boiled alive or executed with the boats where bugs eat them alive. It really bothers me there's such monsters in the world. I prevented my GF from getting kidnapped late one night when we were walking down the road one night and a guy in a car sped into the wrong lane and stopped so close to her the car was almost touching her. He opened the door to pull her in but I was already sprinting towards the car screaming like a psycho and thankfully he sped off. It shocks me how common it can be and how much human trafficking goes on. If I could keep a roof over my head and devote my life to preventing human trafficking and rescuing PPL, I'd like to do it. As long as I could live a meager existence and have enough cheap food to survive, I'd do it if I knew a way. It really fucking disturbs me. I am one of those girls that go to sleep watching true crime stories. One case that really had me thinking was the case of one, maybe the, youngest arsonist. He was a 9-year-old boy who faced 5 counts of murder for burning his family's mobile home. This included 2 toddlers. He was diagnosed with multiple mental disorders. Many words had to be explained to him as he didn't know the vocabulary of the court. Did he actually know what he was doing? Does he feel remorse now? How will this affect his adulthood? In high school, I worked long hours stocking soft drinks around the county I lived in and listened to true crime podcasts to pass the time. The Golden State Killer was one that always had me looking over my solitaire and staying up at night because the 7-part podcast series that was over 8 hours long ended with the fact that they never caught him. This was before they found out who the killer was through DNA testing. Brandon Lawson, even now he's found. I don't know what to believe. I don't think my opinion has changed much. Lee Boxall and Kevin Hicks, I wonder why they haven't been linked given the geography. I see a lot of similarities. Luke Durbin, I lived in Ipswich at the time. Also at the time the serial killer Steve Wright was on the go and 2 of his victims helped a very pregnant me carry my shopping upstairs to my flat. I remember an episode of Forensic Files where a woman walked into her house and was shot and killed by someone in the house. Turns out, the killer was about to start a jail sentence for molesting his baby, and he decided he wanted to go to jail as a murderer instead of a pedophile because he knew how inmates feel about pedophiles. He just randomly chose that house, and she happened to get home before her husband, or else he might have been the one killed. Albert Fish, aka the Gray Man. Serial killer, serial rapist, serial child molester, and serial cannibal. Going into actual detail would require a podcast all on its own, but let's just say that he was the single most fucked up human being to ever exist. Sadomasochistic and a sadist, he would rape boys and then mutilate their penises, shove needles into his own body, and had a lifelong fascination with sacrificing a child to God, like in the story of Abraham. When he was finally executed by the electric chair, motherfucker was excited. The story of 13-year-old Jamie Kloss actually made my skin crawl, and it was relatively recent. Young girl Jamie was kidnapped by a man that had worked with her father once or twice, but he had seen her getting onto a school bus and developed an obsession. The man broke into her family home and shot her father point blank with a shotgun, killing him instantly. Jamie and her mother ran upstairs and hid in a bathroom, which the man soon broke into. Jamie's mother covered her daughter with her own body in the bathtub and tried to plead with the man, but he shot her dead and took Jamie. Jamie was then kept under the man's bed in a hunting cabin for 88 days until she was able to crawl out and run down the road and find help. No amount of therapy is going to make this girl okay again. Look up the story, it'll disgust you. The Soham Murders, 2002. During the extensive search for 2 missing 10-year-old girls, the media interviewed many local residents. One man in particular, who was the last to see the girls before their disappearance, was interviewed numerous times during the 2-week search, becoming somewhat of an unofficial spokesman for the community. You can still watch a lot of his interviews online. His constant media presence caused some of his acquaintances to notice the lies in his story, which they reported to the, already suspicious, police. So creepy to read his ever-changing accounts of what happened to those poor girls, and especially to watch his interviews with hindsight. The Serial Drowner, this is a Finnish case I wrote a podcast script about once. Basically, he was this semi-charismatic bully who kept an entourage of his small town's most desperate alcoholics around his house, and just abused them for shits and giggles until they dropped dead. His mo was to first get everyone super drunk, then announce that everyone was going for a picnic to a nearby island and had to get in his dinghy. Then halfway to the island he's knocked the boat over, and as a skilled swimmer, save himself and watch the others try make it back to shore. And if the cops came, well, everyone was really drunk and he was more lucid, so he just said it was an accident and ignore what the others were rambling on about. This went on for years, but eventually a neighbor witnesses him actually forcing one of his victims underwater. The Baby P case. Baby P and my brother were born on the same day in the same hospital. Baby P's mum was opposite my mum's hospital bed, and my mum knew her from before due to her living about a 5 to 10 minutes walk from our old house. My mum said that Baby P's mum was constantly leaving him to go outside for cigarettes, meeting up with people, etc., and was just leaving the baby crying constantly, which made other newborns cry too. It's sad because whenever my mum saw her around she always seemed like a lovely woman, and nobody can't predict when someone will kill their own child. The Iceman was pretty sick. I read a book about him. One part talks about a mob guy whose daughter was raped. He wanted the rapist to suffer before he died. The Iceman kidnapped him and took him somewhere out in the woods where he would go as a kid. Iceman knew the area was loaded with rats, because he would leave meat out there and watch them devour it as a kid. So he ties the rapist to a tree and proceeds to cut him and put some kind of meat over him. The rapist apparently was eaten alive by the rats. He also filmed it for the mob guy. Brittany Drexel, she was 17 and went missing at Myrtle Beach while on a vacation with some very fake friends. The thing is, she was texting her boyfriend as she was walking the strip alone and stopped responding. After only 10 minutes, her boyfriend gets in touch with her parents, who get the police involved, but there's very little info to go on. And those friends she was with weren't being very helpful. She was grabbed off a crowded street and literally never seen again. They get a bit of info from her phone with the last ping being on the way to a swamp, but said swamp is home to alligators, so searching came up with nothing. This happened in 2009, and for a while, the major consensus from FBI was that she was abducted, trafficked, and then killed and dumped in the swamp. SC has very high sex trafficking rates, like some of the worst in the US. That was also where I left off, but after looking it up now, turns out last May, a dude who was already a registered sex offender and had been released after serving like 20 years for kidnapping and raping a child, confessed to her murder and her body was recovered. He'd been a person of interest in Brittany's case for years, since he was staying at the same hotel she was during her time there. But the entire situation is exactly what goes through my mind now whenever I'm walking alone, staying in an unfamiliar place, or when someone is just giving me bad vibes. That Brittany went missing on a busy street in an instant, and there were people who realized and started searching just as quickly, yet it still took 13 years for her to be found. The murder of Nona Dirksmayer. I was pregnant with my son at the time, and live in the same county where it happened. It kept me up many nights, and still does at times. The man they think did it is in prison now for a total different reason, trying to kidnap numerous women at Walmart and Hobby Lobby. And her BF at the time, who they tried to first pin it on, was found not guilty and became a defense lawyer. The police did such a shoddy job getting evidence, that they really have none. They just automatically accused the BF, while the other guy, who had just got out of prison for trying to kill a female jogger 2 years before, who was also Nana's neighbor, was helping the police. His ex-wife is the one who pointed the police to him. You'd have to look it up. There are so many mistakes that were made. But, it still scares me to think about it. There is a Dateline EP about it. I'm not a crime junkie but I do watch YouTube, TikTok and the news. My heart always goes out to victims and their families. Here are the cases that sends chills to my body. The Skylar Neese case. This goes to show that teenagers are so scary. Pure evil, those two girls, or this case demons. I'm glad they are in prison now. One of them was a friend since 2nd grade. Poor Skylar believed in them till the very end. I'm so angry at the school staff. They knew the girls were plotting, but did nothing. The staff should have been criminally charged. I hope the guilt haunts them forever. Heartbreaking case that still shakes me today. Brian Schaffer case. Goes in a bar and never came out. I hope it gets resolved. I feel for his family. The Burger Chef case. Those poor kids. They just wanted to earn money honestly. The case is unsolved. The Luby's restaurant massacre. Horrible. Just horrible. Innocent families lost their lives. The Lane Bryant department store case. It was a robbery that oh so gone wrong and tragic. The audio was scary. It remains unsolved. The Otaku killer from Japan. The guy's last name was Miyazaki, absolutely no relation to the legendary Hayao Miyazaki. The guy got caught. Thank God. Japan is a lovely place, but it should never be seen as this romanticized anime wonderland. It's a real country with real problems. The Hello Kitty murder. Trigger warning: pedophilia, sexual assault, violence, though that should be assumed a night hostess. She worked in a brothel, was kidnapped by 3 gang/mafia members from the Triad in China. They tortured and sexually assaulted her for a month before killing her and putting her head in a Hello Kitty doll. The only reason they were caught is that one of the members' girlfriend, who was 14 at the time, reported the crime because she claimed that the hostess's ghost was following her. I feel like I should mention that her boyfriend was in his 30s or late 20s. Let me know if I got any details wrong so I can correct it, but Jesus Christ, this one was horrible. I was one of the many neighbors of Vincent Walters. One of the U.S. Marshals' 15 most wanted fugitives. Accused of murdering a woman in San Diego. He was a surprisingly charming, really comfortable to be around him. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him by his alias, and he even began a new family using said alias. He was a really funny guy who would always greet everyone, and we all saw he was a loving husband and father. You would have never guessed what he was up to. He even sometimes made barbecues at his home, and frequently made a joke like, "Oh yay, the FBI is looking for me," whenever he talked about himself. We all took it with humor. When he got captured and the truth got unveiled, no one could believe it. Allegedly, his words when getting caught were, "It was about time." I really think he was making an effort on starting over again, as we all knew him as a hard-working, charismatic man, but what truly disturbed everyone is the fact that we all felt like you can never finishing knowing anyone. I would rather remember him by the person I met, and hopefully, he'll be someday reintegrated into society, and be able to go back with his family. I still think about the victim and feel really sad for her, but we also saw his new family suffer a lot with his departure. It's just these mixed feelings that can keep me up at night. It's nothing crazy like a serial killer or something, but here is the story who didn't let me sleep well the night after I heard it. A couple came home and found a complete mess inside. They called the police, but they didn't find something. After the police left, they started to clean up. While cleaning up, the husband heard a weird noise coming from under the bed. The couple went outside and called the police again. After the police searched under the bed, they found a woman on meth, who was hiding under the bed with a knife. Since I heard this story, I was always afraid that someone is hiding under my bed when I sleep. The case of Silvio S. in Germany. He kidnapped a refugee child, abused him, strangled him. They found masks, used condoms, ropes and cat litter to reduce the smell of the little corpse. It came out that he had killed and buried another child who had been missing for some time. He had put a black mask on the child and wanted to reenact child pornography scenes. He also strangled the child. I can't get over how absolutely disgusting a person can be. And then with innocent children who didn't even have the slightest chance. In court, he didn't want to know anything about it and covered his ears. I have a book about John Wayne Gacy that was written by the lawyer who defended him. One night Gacy got drunk and confessed everything to this lawyer. They were acquaintances beforehand. And there was one thing he said that gave me chills. He was describing how he would not always remember killing his victims afterwards. He said something along the lines of, "Sometimes I wake up, walk out to my living room, and there would be a dead kid on my floor." That fucked me up, being that desensitized to something like murder. The family. And Hamilton Byrne, who convinced people she was Jesus Christ reincarnated, led the Doomsday sect with her husband Bill Hamilton Byrne from 1963 to 1987. The cult was made famous by images of children with bleached blonde bowl cuts and matching outfits. The children were drugged with LSD and subject to beatings. They ate a strictly vegetarian diet and did lots of yoga and exercise. They were brought up to think they would take over the world when it collapsed, which the cult leaders said was imminent. The children in the cult were not all blood relatives, and the Hamilton Byrnes were not their parents. Some of the babies were willingly handed over to their care. Other children were taken from young mothers who were shamed from having babies out of wedlock. She would go to psychiatric hospital and give LSD to patients and tell them she was Jesus and get them to join her cult. She has high-end members of the society, doctors, lawyers and teachers that she was set. That's how she got the children. She even killed 5 people. But Ms. Hamilton Byrne was arrested in the US with the help of the FBI in 1993, but was only prosecuted for minor offenses in Australia. She was never charged with abuse, but fined $5,000 for falsifying the documents of 3 of the children. 3 cases that got me fucked up. Case number 1, Junko Furuta. Junko was a 17-year-old high school student that got kidnapped by the Yakuza. She got raped 500 times by over 100 guys and tortured for 40 days. Case number 2, Hello Kitty. A nightclub hostess by the name of Fan Man Yi was kidnapped by 3 men from the Chinese mafia. Long story short, she was brutally tortured and raped. When the Chinese mafia killed Fan, they boiled her body and sewed her skull in a Hello Kitty mermaid doll. Case number 3, the Toy Box Killer. The fact that he had audio recordings of him talking to his victims is frightening. Probably the murder of Cassie Jo Stoddard. She was house sitting for her aunt and uncle one weekend in 2006 because she was saving up money to get her own car, as because she had just turned 16, she got her license. She had her boyfriend come over to stay with her as the house was a little far out from the rest of the town and was in a heavily wooded area. He invited 2 other friends, Brian Lee Draper and Tori Adamick. These guys were obsessed with the movie Scream and decided they wanted to commit a similar murder to the one in the opening scene. They basically hung out like normal with Cassie and her boyfriend and watched TV, and one of them came up with an excuse to leave for a bit and he snuck down to the basement and unlocked the door. They then both left, saying they were going to see a movie, and then snuck back into the house through the unlocked basement door. They shut off the power and made a bunch of sounds trying to lure Cassie and her boyfriend down there, but they never went down. Eventually, they turned the power back on and decided to only go after Cassie. After a while, her boyfriend's mom came to pick him up, and he asked to stay over with her, but his mom said no. She offered to take Cassie home with them, but Cassie felt she had a responsibility to stay at the house, as she was also pet sitting. After they left, the 2 boys shut off the power again, put on these Halloween masks that they brought with them, went upstairs, and stabbed Cassie to death. She was stabbed 30 times. The creepiest part was that they documented the whole thing with a video camera. Everything leading up to and after the murder. I've seen some of the footage, and it feels like a found footage horror. They even filmed Cassie on the day of her death, at school. She smiles and greets them, but seems really put off by them. The footage that really stuck with me was them driving in their car, on their way and leaving the murder, and they are talking and joking around like it's nothing. I have heard of lots of murders done by teenagers, but this one always stuck out to me because I can't imagine how utterly terrified she must have been. I wouldn't say it kept me up per se, but Edmund Kemper's case was one that stuck out to me for like so many reasons. From the fact that he had shown very concerning ways of acting out in front of his mother who did absolutely about it, to his crazy large stature, which made him even more terrifying as a methodological killer. His crimes were uniquely gruesome, and by the time he was ready to confess, he had to practically beg the police to forgive him because Big Al could never possibly do anything like that, which is literally the other thing that irks me about it. If I remember correctly, I think he had even met and trained another serial killer to essentially be his subordinate, since I guess he wanted to watch TV without him singing all the time. This is an old post, but locally, 45 minutes from my location, there was a 14-year-old boy who went missing. He was gone for 2 months. Everyone thought his parents killed him out of frustration with him. He was autistic and considered by locals a delinquent, until one night when the police searched a house right across from the boy's home again. They went in this time. They found his glasses and clothes on the upper floor of the vacation house under a hole for the chimney. The 14-year-old had tried to gain access to this empty house by climbing to the roof and going through a chimney, not knowing it didn't lead to a traditional fireplace. It instead got tighter and tighter the further down he fell until he was stuck. He literally died in the wall of this vacation house, stuck and asphyxiated in a chimney. His name was Harley Dilly. And I'll never forget him or his name. Trying to remember the case of a 17-year-old boy who ran away from home because his mother was abusive, and he's been in hiding for like a year or more and is waiting for his 18th birthday to show he's actually alive due to fear of DFS sending him back to live with his mom. He had posted TikToks saying he was fine and stopped looking for him but would never show his face. So people were concerned if it was really him or someone acting like him. His birthday is November of this year. I'm trying to follow this case again. Anyone know of what I'm talking about? I have 2 cases that scared me very much. The guys who were inspired by the Scream movie to kill a friend of theirs. I don't know why. There are cases much more frightening than that, but this case always puts me a lot of anguish, especially the way and the tranquility with which they committed that murder, filming and laughing. I'm very sorry for that girl. She who knows when she got scared, poor. And another case whose name I don't remember, but 2 girls kill a friend of theirs who was part of their trio. Scared me especially because while they repeatedly stabbed her, she screamed, "Why are you doing this to me? Why?" After inquiring about these cases, I did not sleep. I found out that a story I knew quite well, where the first victim was my great-great-uncle. I never connected the family name until years later when I was being told that the cousins found out was a huge family secret when grandma got out of prison, from an ABC documentary. Shocked quite a few people that were too young to know. I recall the big get-together where the now grown-up kids were asking the family to keep it a secret. Search for Yvonne Gladys Fletcher, the first woman in Australia to murder her husbands, 2 of them, with rat poison. Her son has a great story about his life as well that is worth looking for. Luis Garavito. He admitted to murdering and raping over 100 young boys in Colombia, but it is suspected that there are more victims. Because it was in Colombia and there is maximum sentence that a person can receive, there is a possible that he could be released. He is currently in his 60s, so still able to overpower a younger boy, especially if he is armed. His ruse was also to pretend to be an old man that needed help to lure the boys away from safety, and that would be really convenient if he was actually older. What he did was horrible, and I really hope he rots in prison for the rest of his life. Whenever I hear the case of either Andre Chikatilo or Albert Fish, both maniacs, both cannibals, both child abusers, both really, really fucked in the head. Chikatilo keeps me up because it pisses me off that he got off for so long and caused so much pain due to the incompetent police. But Albert Fish keeps me up on a different level. While Chikatilo was crazy, he was very calculated. Albert Fish was a chaotic time bomb waiting to go off. His entire life is fucked up from one end to the other, and I wonder if he was ever sane. What a terrifying and alien mind he had, that he not only harmed others for pleasure, but also himself. I don't believe this was a very nationally publicized case. I know about it because it took place in my hometown. For those interested, look up the cold case of 3 missing boys. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton from Morenci, Michigan. To sum it up, the 3 boys, 9, 7, and 5 at the time, went missing on Thanksgiving Day in 2010. The father, John Skelton, had the boys for Thanksgiving and their mother was supposed to pick them up the next day, but when she got to his house, he said he didn't have them. He made up a few different stories, but stuck with the claim that he gave them to a friend who ran an underground organization that would protect the boys from abuse. To this day, the case remains cold and there has been very little movement on it. There was some bone fragments and teeth found in Montana a few years back that raised some suspicion, but the results confirmed they did not belong to any of the boys. Everyone in my hometown believes that he killed them and fed them to pigs to dispose of the bodies, but since there was no evidence, John couldn't be charged with murder. Instead, he was charged with 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. What makes this case even more suspicious and essentially points to John doing more than just giving the boys away is the fact that he was eligible for parole in August of last year. But he declined his own parole hearing. The Toy Box Killer. The bastard Ray Parker had a trailer that he soundproofed which he called his toy box. Inside the trailer, Ray had a dentist chair which he had modified to have arm and leg straps. He had an extensive amount of sex toys and torture devices inside the trailer which he would use against his victims, often keeping them inside the trailer for months at a time. I have a few that really stuck with me. The Toy Box Killer, David Parker Ray. He would kidnap women and torture them. He bought a storage container and turned it into his toy box. The container was filled with BDSM toys, torture instruments and had a modified gynecology chair in the center. He would play them a tape of what he was going to do to them. It's on YouTube, but just be careful. It's absolutely horrific and made me feel sick, drugged them so they had no memory of any of it. Eventually one woman escaped and the police arrested him. They discovered a whole shelf of tapes of what he did but couldn't identify any of the victims, until they found one with a distinctive tattoo. They put out an appeal and found the victim. She had no memory of what happened because of the drugging but experienced nightmares and memory loss from around that time. But that was the evidence they needed to prosecute him. The Junko Furuta case. 16-year-old Japanese schoolgirl rejected a classmate after he asked her out. 4 teenagers then kidnapped her and brought her to one of the teen's parents' house. They forced Junko to phone her parents to tell them that she's run away. She was also forced to tell the teenager's parents that she's his girlfriend. It was apparent something was wrong, but the parents were too scared of their son to say anything. She was tortured for 44 days. I don't even want to type out what they did to her. I've never in my life read anything as horrifying as that. By the end, she was unrecognizable. She was so disfigured she didn't look human. On day 44 she succumbed to her injuries. The boys put her in a barrel of concrete. The worst part is that the kidnappers got away with it with only a slap on the wrist. Andrei Chikatilo. He thought he was impotent until he found the only thing that gives him sexual satisfaction was raping and killing people. He started preying on young girls when he was a teacher. He would get fired but was able to get 2 further teaching jobs elsewhere. Then he started his killing spree. He targeted children of both sexes. It took years and 50+ victims to find him. At first an innocent man was arrested and was tortured into giving a confession to a crime he didn't do and was sentenced to death. When Andrei was eventually found, he was sentenced to death and was executed. Richard Bloss is an infamous Canadian gangster and multiple murderer. Born in Montreal, he was nicknamed Le Chat, French for the cat, because of his luck in evading death after surviving at least 3 assassination attempts from the Italian mafia, a police shootout, and escaping from custody 3 times. Bloss was also a master in the art of sharing the details of his life and his sad exploits with the media. He even sent photos showing him with weapons, as much to taunt his rivals as the police. Between 1965 and 1975 Bloss was suspected of 21 murders. Qualified as the most dangerous criminal in Canada by the Crown Prosecutor, Claude Girard, Richard Bloss is a brilliant, arrogant, and very dangerous criminal. He carried out an escape that some consider the most important escape of the century in Canada. Douglas Garland from Canada. It was a guy who held a grudge against a man for years over a business deal that never happened, and then randomly decided to kill the man's wife, and their young grandson. He broke into their house in the middle of the night and kidnapped them and brought them back to his farm and tortured them all before killing them. That story stuck with me and bothered me a lot. Especially the poor little grandson who just happened to be there that night for a sleepover at his grandparents' house. Any case where the criminal easily flew under the radar for years, and then just killed people. You know, the ones who had odd behaviors and in retrospect had things wrong with them, but they aren't ones that people would necessarily think would lead to them killing someone. Like Scott Peterson, Chris Watts, Jeffrey McDonald, or even Casey Anthony. Looking back at their past, there are some things that really stand out as not so great, sometimes 7 signs of mental instability, but nothing that the average person would look at and say, this person is going to kill someone one day. Because I have people in my family with severe mental/personality disorders, and I think most people looking at them realize they're strange and can be us sometimes, but there's nothing that screams they'll murder someone. And yet, they've had periods of instability where I can imagine if things had gone on just a bit longer or if one or two things had changed, they could snap. And it makes me wonder if the people we hear about on the news had those traits, too, and it was just something only those living with them, often the ones no longer around to tell us, knew about. I'm not sure the name of the movie, or even if it was a true story, but I remember watching it when I was around 10 to 12, and it really got me into true crime, and also made me realize I wasn't alone, and people had it worse than me. Basically, this little girl and her sibling, I think a sister, go to live with their relatives after their parents pass away. I think things are pretty normal in the beginning, but they end up chaining up the oldest sibling that came to live with them, putting out cigarette on her, letting the aunt and uncle's children torture and rape her. Unthinkable things. In the end, I believe a little boy who had a crush on her tried to get her help, but they ended up castrating her. I'm sorry if that's not the right word. They burned her vagina with something that was hot and metal. The cops got there right before she passed away, and I'll never forget the story. The Slenderman stabbing. I forgot the name, so it might be a bit confusing, sorry lol. Basically, these girls were in a group of 3. Girl 1 and 2 both loved Slenderman and somewhat worshipped him and would do anything for him. One day, they all had a sleepover when Girl 1 and 2 decided they wanted to kill Girl 3 to please Slenderman. They brought her out into the woods and stabbed her many times before walking off into the woods to try find Slenderman's cabin. Girl 3 survived and went to the police. Obviously Girl 1 and 2 were not sane, but the way they tried to jill someone to please a fictional character? Johnny gosh. Pedo ring, random kidnapping, or did dad have something to do with setting it up? Is haunted me for years. I feel like we'll never know, but finding Jacob Wetterling after so many years gave me hope. Morgan Nick. Abducted at a baseball game when tying her shoe out of sight of friends. A split second and she was gone just like that. I know Aton Pat's case was closed with a conviction, but is Pedro Hernandez actually the man that took and killed him? I would love to say 100% that I believe it, but it's never sat well with me. I almost feel like his mental problems wanted the attention and or he confessed to get out of society. Again, unless Aton's remains are found, not likely we'll ever know for absolute sure. Without a body, it's all circumstantial. Hernandez was convicted and sent to prison, maybe because they finally could throw the book at someone. Odd that Jose Ramos, the convicted pedo boyfriend of Aton's babysitter, never resonated enough with investigators to send him to trial, but one mentally unstable man tells a story and confesses, and he's the one and only to go to trial all these years later. Ted Bundy, without a doubt. He is an example of pushing the limit. The confidence and dedication is something not very well seen upon this subject of true crime. To do what he did is to play the life of 2 different people. The prime example to show you the type of attitude this guy had is the fact he had a girl in college he was absolutely in love with. She dumped him on his lack of self. He builds himself back up after the breakup, to later get her interested in him again. Just so he could dump her. Which he did.